Welcome to the first section of Module 1, Stories versus Situations. Now, if you're new to the Story Geeks universe, you'll know that there are these terms, stories and situations. Maybe you won't know that there are distinctions between these two things. Everything's a story. I take a little different tack on that, and I think it's a very significant tack difference and makes a huge difference in the writing process because stories and situations, as I define them, are handled differently in the actual development and in the writing process, which we'll get into when we get deeper into this. But it's important to know that this idea that you have a story, or if you don't have a story, what do you have? You have this thing called a situation. Well, what is that? Maybe you know, maybe you understand that concept. But what we're going to talk about here is this is really the first fundamental step in self-assessing whether or not your story is going to work, whether or not you have this fundamental piece of the development process figured out. If you don't, you're going to mix things up in terms of the writing process, in terms of how you focus on development. It has a very, very broad impact on your development process and on your physical writing of pages. Okay, so first things first. Before you can assess these things, you have to know what they are. Now, in the creative writing world, lots of people define these terms, or at least they try to define these terms. My terms are a little different. So now, in the creative writing world, people talk about what a story is. They talk around at least the concept of what a situation might be. Most people don't really touch on this at all. But it's important to have some, grounding in these terms to understand. So I've got my own definitions for these things, which we're going to review right now, so that you at least are starting off on the same page as all the other people out there who are taking this class and who may have already taken Anatomy of a Premise Line or other classes with me. They will know this topic fairly well. Or if you have a copy of Anatomy of a Premise Line, the book, this is like one of the first chapters where we talk about this. So let's look at our definitions here first, and then we'll look at the components of what makes these things up from my perspective, which help you assess in the self-assessment process. So a situation is what you have. I'm not going to read blurb for blurb here because you can do that on your own. A situation is what you have basically when you don't have a moral component, which we will talk about later in this class, what a moral component is, if you're not familiar with it. It's what's left after you assess your story premise idea and realize you don't really have a moral component. What you have is something else now. You don't have a story because a moral component is the key heart of having a story. If you have a situation, that's what you have when you don't have a moral component, but you've got a plot idea, you've got a premise idea. It is driven by the plot, almost 120%. And it is all external. It is not based in character flaws, character motivations. There's just one motivation. Get to the end of the ride. Okay, this is the classic example of this is the 20-something kids caught in the cabin in the woods and the monster's outside is going to eat them. No one's going to have a big revelation about what happened when they were 5 and, oh my gosh, the monster's really my father and I have to resolve this with my father. No. The only two questions are who's going to get out alive and how bloody is it going to get? You can't get more situational than that. And there are tons of examples of this in books, tons of examples of this in movies and TV, where characters are up against a problem. That's it. An external problem that they've got to solve, fix, move on from, whatever. Situations are all about plot and seldom, if ever, about character. I think you get the idea. So if that's a situation thing, what's a story? Well, this is a story. Now, this is a little bit of gobbledygook here, but that just try to read past that. It is a combination, interplay of character and plot. That's a metaphor for a character on a journey of change. They're going to be different at the end than they are at the beginning. But they can't do this change thing, unless there's something to change, i.e. us. Therefore, you must have a moral problem. You must have what I call the moral component. Again, we'll talk a lot more detail about this later on. But this is the hallmark of a story, is you've got a character on a journey to fix this thing inside them that is manifesting itself outside them in behavior that's creating trouble in the world for them. You handle stories and situations very differently on the page. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But those are the definitions. One is basically missing the moral component, and it's all about the plot, and the other is all about the plot and all about character. That's the difference between these two things. Go back and review these two definitions, integrate them, think about them, fuse them into your psyche. Once you understand what you have, one versus the other, you have a roadmap immediately about how you have to develop your story. Okay, and we'll talk about that, but that's how critically important this is. So those are the definitions. Now let's break those down a little bit, because this is the self-assessment part. You have to understand. You have to be able to assess these definitions properly in the context of your story idea, in order to make the assessment that you have one versus the other. The moral component thing is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room. If you don't have one of those things and you understand what that is, this moral component thing, you don't have to do all this other analysis. You got a situation if you don't have it. It's that simple. But let's look at these just so we're complete on this informational part. So 5 components. Again, I'm not going to read through all these. You can do that on your own. This is a video. Just stop it and read them. Okay. But these are the 5 things that constitute a situation that really define even further these concepts. You're dealing with a problem, puzzle, mystery, conundrum. That's the thing. That's the whole shebang. It's the alien invasion. It's the monster outside. It's the serial killer. You're just trying to get the guy. You're trying to stop the invaders. You're trying to kill the monster. That's all this is going to be about. Not bad, not wrong. This is an important note. A lot of people hear me talk about stories versus situations and come to the conclusion that, oh, well, Jeff Lyons is saying that stories are better than situations. No, they're not. They're different, and they require a different writing approach and development approach. That's why I make the distinction, because you have to know what you've got. One isn't better than the other. Jurassic Park, the book and the movie, isn't really a story. It's a situation. The monster outside going to eat everybody. Yeah, you've got some implications of, one of the protagonists having a problem with, human connection and being too focused on the past and the relics, and it's very Indiana Jones-ish that way. He's even got a hat. Okay, so you've got some themes going here, but it doesn't really get developed very much, So it's not critical to the dinosaurs killing people or the political and scientific problem being presented. There's a moral question for sure about whether or not, scientists are so busy worrying about whether they didn't stop to think about whether they should. That famous line, right? But it's still more of a situation. Okay, so that's really what's going on. And then there's a very clear, distinct solution to the problem or the puzzle. Find the killer, kill the monster, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Every Agatha Christie story ever written that she wrote were all cozy mystery situations. That's what they were, more than anything else. So, and she cried all the way to the bank, right? She's a famous writer. So there's nothing wrong with situations. There's nothing right about stories. It depends on what your agenda is. Okay. So you're dealing with a problem situation. It doesn't reveal character. It doesn't really open up character windows into the psyche and internal dynamics, emotional dynamics of a character that has to change. It's really just testing their problem-solving skills. So that's really what situations do. It can be great fun, but you're not really getting under the hood in a situation. The story stakes, again, are all about ratcheting up the puzzle and the mystery, making it more compelling, creating more danger, plot danger, not character conflicts necessarily. That's an issue, is that the story stakes are really focused on ratcheting up that initial problem that you created for the protagonist to solve, which is an external event driving them. There is no change, really. The character is pretty much the same person at the end of that story, that situation than they were at the beginning. The emotional space of the situation itself doesn't really change. Are they better for having survived this horrible crucible of the monster outside? Yes, but they've always been that person. That they haven't really changed. Maybe they were pushed to that edge and they weren't there before, but that's not a moral problem. That's just, I'm okay. There's no there, really, emotionally. This is what we'll talk about later on is the myth of the steadfast character. Basically good person at the start, basically good person at the end, but they've been challenged by this terrible disaster or whatever they've got to get out of a lot. Situations are the no-win scenario that the character wins. And that's okay. It's because they've got great problem-solving skills. It's not because of a character flaw that they've overcome necessarily. And I'm qualifying this a little bit because we'll get into this later on. There are some nuances in development where people imply there's a moral component, but they don't ever deliver it. So you're always like in this netherworld of the suggestion that it's there, but it's never really delivered. And so it ends up being more situational than a story. And that's the key. That's the key thing at the very, very end. There is a weak or suggestive moral blind spot or moral component, and it never really delivers or is paid off or is missing entirely, leading to episodic writing. Okay. So these are the 5 hallmarks. If you go through your idea and you assess your idea as a situation, these 5 elements will be there more than not. A story, however, has these 5 components. This is how you know you have a story. Stories are about the human condition. It's why we write them. We're trying to say something about what it means to be human. If you have something to say about being a human being, then you want to write a story, not a situation. It is all about testing character, all about revealing windows into and getting under the hood of that protagonist. That's what stories do best. Reveal character in the context of conflict and clarity of emotional motivation that leads to behavior. That's a story. The twists and turns and subplots and all of it are all at service, not to the puzzle, not to the mystery, not to killing the monster, but to revealing that change process in the protagonist. All of those elements of ratcheting up story stakes are at service to building your protagonist's emotional states that lead to their final disposition, either good or bad. Doesn't always have to end with a happy note. It can be a very down note. These stories always end in a different emotional space at the end than they were in at the beginning, because you have a character on a journey of change, not just a journey of tilting windmills, not just a journey of killing monsters. There is emotional shifts taking place across the middle and the end of your story. And that happens because you have a narrative engine that won't quit, called the moral component. The moral component is so critically important because it is literally the engine of the middle of every story. Without it, the center cannot hold, and you will end up with what I call episodic writing, vignette writing. We'll talk a lot more about that later on in other modules, but that's the consequence. We'll talk about that actually here in a bit. Okay, so those are the 2 definitions. So why does all this matter? Because it's not just a theoretical question. There are consequences to one of these things versus the other. One is a very passive protagonist. One is a very active protagonist. This whole construct of the passive protagonist loop and the active protagonist loop that I teach in the Anatomy of Premise line. And you can learn much more about that. Just go off and find it. But situations inherently have passive protagonists. Passive in this context means things are happening to them from the outside, and they're a leaf on the dramatic wind, getting pushed into problem solving. They're reactive all the time, as opposed to a story protagonist who is active. They are actively participating in their own destruction. Across the middle of the book, they're in what I call a pattern of decline. They're going deeper and deeper into the negativity of their blind spot, making bad choice after bad choice after bad choice, which leads to a new problem, new complication. They're the source of their own misery. Yes, the aliens might still be invading. Yes, the monster might be outside going to eat everybody. That's plot, though. How they're reacting to those events, external events, is their motivation, is their real motivation. As they try to deal with the aliens, they're doing it from their blind spot, making terrible choices. being too self-centered, being too frightened, being whatever is their problem. And every time they make a bad choice, that is active protagonist in action. That's what active means. They're the ones generating their conflict. They're the ones generating the problems for themselves. Outside of the external problems, they're also generating internal problems that manifest in the story in the form of personal interrelationship conflict. That's active, not reactive. So this is a critical idea. If you have a situation, you're going to inherently have a passive protagonist. So you have got to just kill it when it comes to entertainment value, when it comes to set pieces, when it comes to action, when it comes to the plot challenges of the mystery and all of that. That's got to just kill it to hold your reader's attention, because you're not going to have this interesting emotional story. Another consequence is that having a missing or weak moral component undermines causation, yielding episodic writing. Episodic writing, and again, we'll talk more about this in a bit later on in the modules. Episodic writing is vignettes. They're all standalone little stories within the bigger story. And they all have a beginning and an end, but and episodes don't affect anything necessarily. They can just be informational. They could be historical backstory context. Nothing wrong with that. But when you have too many of these episodes or vignettes, you undermine the throughput of the A-line story, of your main story, by chopping it up into these little episodes, and you screw with the pace of your work. So that's one of the consequences of episodic writing. If you have a situation and a weak moral component, the narrative engine of your middle will sputter and die. You don't have anything holding it together unless you've got a great action line going that everything can fall off of, can hang off of, like clothes on a clothesline. If you've got that, then you could probably pull this off. But if you don't, it's going to lose energy and it's going to just putter. There won't be any change of your protagonist. That's not what you're going for in a situation. But if you're trying to write a story and you have more of a situation, you're going to find yourself forcing that change, and it's going to feel unreal, and it will not, quote, ring true to your readers, and you will lose them. You'll simply lose them because there is no real change. Even if you make the change happen, they're not going to see how and why it happened. There's no causation. The story math isn't going to add up. And when you have these consequences that I've been talking about, you end up with a very plot-heavy dependency, and entertainment value rather than character drives everything. Again, not bad and wrong, but you better have an incredibly strong entertainment value that just kills it, that just makes people go, wow. Then you can pull this stuff off. So these are the consequences, some of the main consequences of having stories versus situations that you have to be careful of. These are the pitfalls that you're going to fall into. Okay. The last thing I want to mention is this idea, it's a myth, called the steadfast character. And I'm raising this because this is very often an argument that a lot of people have for why situations are really stories. You have a character who's a basically good person, and then the aliens invade. And now they've got to save their family from being abducted and probed and all that kind of stuff by the aliens. And along the way, they come up against the drone monsters, and they come up against the hybrid clone beasties, and they come up against the aliens themselves and their drone minions. One problem after another. Evil thing after another they've got to overcome, and each time they've got to get stronger. They've got to become more resourceful, and they're basically the good person they've always been, but now they're maybe a little more violent, a little more. They're going into a space they're not used to going into. The steadfast character, and they win the day. They get into the alien spaceship, and they find the family about to be consumed by the blah blah blah, and they get them out, and everybody's safe, and then the aliens die. I'm better for what happened to me. I'm the stronger parent. I'm a good guy. I've always been a good guy, but now I'm a better guy. Well, sorry. That's the steadfast character. Always steadfast. The emotional space is really no different at the end of that steadfast story than it is at the beginning. They're the same basic guy or gal. They haven't changed. They've just become more committed to their steadfastness. Here's the reality of what story character change means. Your story cannot stay in the same place. That's what the steadfast story is. Nothing really changes. The person is basically the same person. There's no change. It's like that great scene from the movie adaptation where Nicolas Cage, asks the Robert McKee character on stage, what if I want to write a story where nothing happens and characters don't change? It's that idea. I want to write that kind of a story. Nobody writes that kind of a story for a reason. It's boring. No one's going to want to read it or watch it. Okay. But I digress. So steadfast, boom, stuck right there. No change. That's never going to work in a story. You either change for the better and become a better person because you fix the moral problem you've got that's driving everything under the surface, or you go backward and you digress and you become like Michael Corleone. You make a bad choice at the end to go deeper into your moral problem instead of going out of it, and you become the monster, the devil, the Godfather. Stepping backward is change. Okay? There's no such thing as staying steadfast in the middle. Even the character that says to themselves, I refuse to change, I'm steadfast, I will not change, that is in fact a step backward. The choice not to change is still a choice, and it does not make them more of who they are. It keeps them in the less of who they are. So even the steadfast character is represented by the idea that they refuse to change, which is a step backward. You either go forward or backward. You don't ever just stay where you are. And even if you do stay where you are, that is in effect, dramatically, a step backward. Okay. So that's the myth of the steadfast character. Don't do those kind of characters. They're a dead end. Dramatically, comedically, on every level, they're a dead end. So that's stories versus situations. On the surface, it looks like it's all just theoretical, but it's not. It's very practical in the sense that once you make an assessment of this piece and you decide you've got this versus that tells you what to do. If you have a situation, you've got to be clever. You got to be entertaining. You got to be engaging. You got to have an action line that's going to, like I said, kill it. You've got to focus on those things and come up with great set pieces and exciting moments. And it's all about the entertainment value. If you're writing a story, you got to do all those things anyway. But you've also got to now add in this complex layer of human motivation and emotion called the moral component. And all that fun action stuff is at service to that. How do you bring that to the foreground rather than leave it in the background? So knowing you have a situation versus a story tells you where you have to focus your writing and your development. That's why this is so critically important to understand. Okay, so next we're going to look at another critical piece called premise, which is one of the foundational concepts of everything I teach, but it's really the foundational piece for you to understand whether or not you've got something that's going to work in the long run. So I'll see you in that next section.